All the organizers, Kadirhas, Navarino, and I repeat what I said during, because we have some more friends here around the table, and welcome, Thessaloniki, and Dimitri, the president, the chairman of Navarino. This is an excellent civil society network. You know, we are not very keen in Greece to have this kind of networks. We are looking at the state as the only, provider. But Navarino Network has paved the way that is unique, I would say. So I'm very glad to chair this panel this afternoon because I have around me very good colleagues and friends with whom we have worked for many years, to the benefit, I think, of our mutual national and intellectual interests. And mutual interest, you know, is something that sometimes we don't understand, but they do exist, and we have to explore more paths to common interests by preserving always, what we describe, define as vital national interests. It's not contradictory. And the organizations I represent tries to do exactly this, to combine national interests with supranational interests. And I would dare say with success, because you have, it's not only about Greece and Turkey. You may have many diverging interests on behalf of countries, but when you are at the table, at the committee level, at the ambassadorial level, at the minister's level, at the heads of state and government level, you try to have a common denominator, which is not the lowest common denominator, because all these countries around the table recognize that they can better serve the national interest through this supranational structure. It's not contradictory at all. On the contrary, I would say that multinational organizations offer nations the possibility to get added value for their national perspectives and national interests. This is all about. You cannot be isolated, especially in our times. And isolation is bad for a country. You have to sit at the table and to try to define your interests in accordance to established rules. It's a rules-based system. This is what I'm trying to persuade you about, that we have to serve the rules-based system. If you don't serve as a country, as a diplomat, as a scholar, the rules-based system, then I think you end up with a lot of troubles. And since, our region is very prone to trouble anyway, because of history and traditions and, let's say, also culture, I would say sometimes. I would start on a personal note, and then I will give the floor, because the gentlemen at the table are very knowledgeable and very experienced, and they are also, of course, more, they can speak more scholarly than I can speak. But when I arrived at NATO in 2002, I started working. I had in mind, this Mediterranean mentality. You have to raise your voice. You have to yell at people. I was testing the waters, and finally I understood that there's no room for fight. Because if you fight, you lose your eye. I mean, you have the Dutch opposite you have, you know, the Nordics. I mean, you cannot fight the way we fight in our beloved Mediterranean world. We don't fight. You can argue, you can discuss. You have to persuade. You have to persuade. Just flagging your rights, it's not enough. So I would say that our diplomats and our militaries are doing this exercise for more than 60 years now. And this, from my point of view, and I strongly believe in this, it's a very successful exercise for both countries. Because in this way, our countries are sitting around the same table, they are working together, they are at committee meetings together, they fight together because they are in operations. Right, and this is the ultimate offer that a country can provide, providing human lives, troops. I mean, they are in operations together, they are gaining experience so they can better serve the national interest. So this is why, I mean, I repeat, and I will not be more bavard, okay, because, I mean, our colleagues have a lot to say. I mean, this is why I strongly believe in the usefulness of Greece and Turkey being members of NATO. It's the only organization. They sit around the table, they have the same rights, they can support the national interests, the national positions. At the same time, they listen to each other's positions, they compromise, there is a dialogue. And this dialogue can further develop. I am, as I said in my briefing that you honored to be present here, there is much more to do for Greek-Turkish relations. And we have, especially your generation, you have to persuade. We are all here in favor of diplomacy, not only of rapprochement, of deepening relations, of giving new impetus. We need it because geography and history put us together in this marvelous part of the world. Okay, we eat the same food. This is very important for people, you know. I mean, to understand, to have the same taste. I would dare saying we love passionately, okay? So we have the same approach to life. These are very important elements, you know. Sometimes you underestimate these elements. It's very important for people living the. So on this note, I will pass the floor and I will give the floor to colleague, Mr. Friedrich, to kick off the debate. What we can do now?
Okay, the topic for us was Turkish-Greek relations in context of NATO. This was a very popular topic and subject during the Cold War and during those good old days. Remember somebody asked you whether you are nostalgic in NATO about the Cold War days? Yeah, I'm sure. There are many people who are nostalgic, especially academics who make sense more easily of what's happening in global politics. In those days, Turkey and Greece, for NATO for Turkey and Greece meant an occasion, a place where they had an opportunity to exchange views. Many of you are younger, from the younger generation, and you don't remember, but you would have read the tense relationship between Turkey and Greece in those days. And NATO was a good place of diplomacy, where two countries' representatives came together for the same purpose. They felt same threats most of the time. NATO also meant for these countries to keeping balance in between them, especially in the age, especially on the security perspective and militarization. And also the Cold War pressures or bipolarity of Cold War actually meant that the environment was not suitable for Turkey and Greece to fight each other. I would argue, I think most of you would have agreed that if there was no Cold War during the 1970s, for example, Greece and Turkey might have had a war easily. The Cold War and NATO had helped to these countries to avoid a direct military confrontation, even though they talked about it all the time. And of course, NATO meant for Turkey and Greece a military security support, that neither country was really equipped to deal with the Cold War security environment at that time. For Turkey, of course, NATO also meant a connection to the West in general. But for that perspective, Greece was also important because Greece was for Turkey a land connection to NATO. That's why a few days ago, when President Erdogan visited Greece, he was talking about we allowed you to come back to NATO in 1980. But if you read the discussions in 1980, why Turkey withdrew its veto power to allow Greece to return on the military side of NATO, was that the argument at the time was that Greece links us to the body of NATO. Without Greece, we have a huge territory and no connection with NATO whatsoever, territorial at least. This, I think, at least made sense until mid-1980s. When Father Papandreou came to power in Greece, he started to have different rhetoric about NATO and Greece's presence in NATO and in general Greece's threat perceptions. So from that time onwards, maybe a diversification started to appear as far as NATO is concerned, what it meant for Turkey and for Greece. At the same time, NATO was an organization where Turkey and Greece watched each other very carefully and minutely, actually. Turkish representatives and Greek representatives, especially the military representatives in different committees, watched the other side, what they were telling, what they were planning or thinking, and they vetoed each other quite often. There were many times in NATO politics that either Greece or Turkey blocked movement of NATO operations, plans, and exercises, and etc., because they thought that NATO was kind of taking a side, or at least it imagined that NATO was taking a side. In fact, NATO was actually very partial, very careful not to take side between Greece and Turkey during the Cold War. After the Cold War, I would say NATO has lost its meaning in terms of Greek-Turkish relations. The environment has changed. Threat perceptions have diversified. NATO's general threat perception is, I would argue, different than Turkey's and different than Greece's. We all have, because of the end of the Cold War and end of the bipolarity, now we have a ability or luxury to have different interests and to talk about different threat perceptions and interests. During the Cold War, this was not really possible because of that heavy Cold War environment. But after the Cold War, everything has started to change. But at the same time, Turkey and Greece has changed. And actually mentioned in her previous talk about this earthquake diplomacy after 1999. Turkey and Greece started to have this what now called proximity talks between the foreign ministries. And it's been going on so far, 20 plus years. So this has changed the kind of an environment between Turkish-Greek relations. And the need for a third party, bipartisan party like NATO to interfere or put pressure on either country is also declined. The propensity to wage the possibility of open warfare between Greece and Turkey also declined at the end of the Cold War. So this also, I think, weakened the relevance of NATO in terms of Greek policy. Of course, it's still important. Of course, even today, the Turks and Greeks watch each other very carefully in NATO commissions and meetings. But I think the pressure has been kind of moved away. And I think the moving of Greek-Turkish relations into a diplomatic sphere has helped them too. From individual perspectives, Turkey's security environment and perception of security has widely changed since the end of the Cold War. Just very briefly, when the Cold War ended, most of the Western countries, most of the West felt that, okay, now the peace has emerged in Europe for the first time in 50 years, since the end of the Second World War. The Cold War ended, the vision of Europe is finishing, ending, and there is a peace dividend. We used to talk a lot about peace dividend. And most of the countries in Western Europe benefited from that peace dividend. Many countries decreased their spending on military, on defense issues. They also decreased the number of soldiers under arms. So they all benefited and they used that money for their economy. For Turkey, it was quite different. Turkey, I would argue, many people argue actually, was one of the very few countries which didn't really benefit from the end of the Cold War in terms of peace dividends. Because at the end of the Cold War, let's remember, 1991, there was a war in the Gulf between Iraq and Kuwait. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and international coalition, including Turkey and the United States, moved into there. There was a war there. There was a war in the Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, and there was a war in the Balkans, former Yugoslavia. And so Turkey was in the middle of these three warring regions. So for Turkey, the environment was not that much different from the Cold War. Of course, maybe even worse. So Turkey didn't benefit from the peace dividend and kept investing on military, etc. And since then also, I would think that Turkey's security interests have a little bit diverged generally from NATO and from Greece. And at this time, of course, Greece, having become a member of European Union, helped Greece to move away from some of the threats and some of the security problems that Turkey kept feeling, and Greece has moved away from that. Being part of Europe also happened. So that kind of a diversification started. Another point that I like to make is about the membership of these countries in NATO. The Greek public, you would know more than I do, but Greek public was always quite suspicious about NATO and NATO membership. My Greek friends and always told me that the Greeks felt that NATO supported Turkey more than they supported Greece, which is not true. I mean, NATO was very careful all the time to be partial between a conflict between two of its members. But nevertheless, the perception in Greece was that in Greek-Turkish conflict, NATO was supporting Turkey by doing nothing against Turkey. That was the perception. Then, of course, in 1980s, Greek security threat perception with Papandreou, the father, has changed famously that he said the threat to Greece comes from the east, not from the north. So from Turkey, not from Russia. That was Soviet Union at the time. That's what he meant. Of course, this created a kind of a suspicion in Greece. And of course, it was related with the United States of America. How the America is perceived in Greece, in its relation to the Greek domestic politics, the military intervention here, and the Cyprus issue and everything. So So NATO was always kind of suspicious in this. Not in Turkey until recently. During the Cold War, NATO was not suspicious, much suspicious. We didn't know much about NATO in Turkey, except that it's a good alliance, we are part of it. And it was a kind of a linchpin for Turkey, a very strong linchpin for Turkey to its Western connection. The suspicions and kind of distancing itself from NATO started almost at the end of the 1990s, in 2000s mostly. And I think this is kind of much to do with the diverging security perceptions of Turkey from the rest of NATO. NATO became much more interested in enlarging itself into the Eastern Europe. So its interest is moved to what today we call northern flank and southeastern flank. Whereas during the Cold War, the southeastern flank was very important where Turkey and Greece was. And Turkey's security perceptions and threat perceptions moved to the Middle East, where NATO is not very much active. So this kind of a diversification, I think, started to affect the people's perception. So we do surveys, many people do in Turkey, we do at Kadir Has University every year, a couple of surveys, actually, in 2 different surveys. In the last 6 years, we asked the same question about NATO, as the support of Turkish population for NATO membership, and etc. It fluctuates. When Turkey feels very much threatened, the public support to NATO increases. When threats are from neighborhood increases, support to NATO also decreases. And it also fluctuates with the response of some of the NATO countries about Turkey's perceived security needs. For example, when Turkey feels threatened from Iraq or Syria and asks NATO to support, let's say, with Patriot missiles. Of course, NATO doesn't have itself Patriot missiles, but its members does. So Holland, United States, Italy, Spain, Germany, at different times sent Turkey Patriot missiles to defend Turkish territory against possible missile attacks from Iraq or Syria. But for the Turkish perspective, the discussion in those countries, domestic discussions in those countries, whether to send this kind of defense modules to Turkey, prior to sending them, creates a kind of a backlash in Turkish public. In Germany, when there is a discussion about whether to send these Patriot missiles to Turkey, whether it's on the national interest of Germans, then Turkish psyche becomes very suspicious about the main particular of NATO, which is Article 5. So people start questioning whether if Turkey was attacked directly, would other NATO members come to support of Turkey because of this public discussions in NATO members. So this kind of public trust in NATO has increased kind of changed and diminished. One other issue that NATO in Turkish relations has in recent years become kind of entangled is NATO-EU connection. You briefly mentioned, but you didn't move into that discussion, which is a very conflicting part of it. Turkey, in a sense, blocks or at least limits NATO-EU partnership in various areas because Turkey blocks NATO's information and intelligence sharing with non-member countries, which of course actually meaning Cyprus. Because of the conflict in Cyprus, or unresolved dispute, let's say, Republic of Cyprus is not a member of NATO. It never applied anyway, but even if it applied, it wouldn't have a chance because of Turkish people power there. But this kind of a triangle, of course, weakens NATO-EU partnership and cooperation. And we have to, I think, talk about the elephant in the room, which is Russia. It's not mentioned much here, I think, yet, but Russia has become quite active in recent years. You all followed and heard whether Russia was involved in domestic politics of Washington and the United States, whether it was affected, it was involved in the elections and etc. We don't know, but it's very noticeable that both public diplomacy, this is of course another word now, a nicer word for the older operations and etc. From military perspective, but public relations of Russia have went a notch up. For example, in Turkey, they have now a couple of newspapers and TV channels broadcasting in Turkish, and they do the same thing in other NATO countries as well. So I think it has become important issue to reckon with. I haven't seen any study yet. This is very important. Maybe some of you who are doing PhDs and masters could look at it. I think this is quite important. What's the message that Russia is delivering to Greece, for example, or to Turkey, or to other NATO countries? Are there differences, nuances in the messages that Russia is delivering to these countries? I know, for example, I read some of the Russian-sponsored newspapers or internet blogs in Turkey in Turkish. And if you read the language, there is very hidden. You can understand there is very hidden agenda there. So maybe somebody could do something. Whether this is important in Turkish relations also. Is there a different messages going to these countries and about NATO? Because in Turkey, I know there is a kind of a subliminal message going to the Turkish public about NATO from the Russian sources. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating account, very condensed, of what happened in our relations during a long period of time. I would say just, not to take time from you, Dimitri, because anyway you are going to take me.
What does she
But I think, reflecting on what you said, Mustafa, I would say that there are some very important barriers that it would not be for the benefit of both countries to cross. And I think NATO's help countries not to cross these barriers. You alluded that our countries could, I would say, easily slip towards a conflict on many occasions. The conflict was prevented because of the membership, because it would be so harmful to the alliance that the conflict had to be prevented. So this is already something very positive coming out of this relation. Another thing that I would say, especially under the current juncture, is important to stress, is that in Greek-Turkish relations there are ups and downs, okay? And the ups and downs are also related to the position of each country. For example, we can say that for many years now, at least the years of the crisis, Turkey seems more powerful economically than Greece. But nevertheless, this is a threshold not to pass. The balance of forces. Independently of each country's force, you can say that Turkey is more powerful from a certain point of view, and Greece is less powerful because of the financial crisis. It is important to see that the two countries are not seeing each other, are not approaching each other through the spectrum of balance of power. I mean, because it would not be beneficial for both countries. I mean, if, for example, Turkey thinks that we are more powerful now, so we have to behave in a certain way, it would not be beneficial, from my point of view, for Turkey as well. A second, let's say, very, very common Greek-Turkish, one of the aspects of the relationship is the relation with the EU. Greece was always in favor of Turkish adhesion process, and rightly so, because it helps in Turkish advance democratization and so on. And we still are in favor of this EU process, this is very clear. And I think there is a consensus here. I mean, no political force is putting in question the European perspective of our neighbor. So this is another point that maybe we have to discuss. And on this note, I pass the floor to my very good friend, GTYLS, for his short presentation.
I hope so too. Yes. Okay. First of all, let me thank Ino for the tremendous support in this effort, and welcome our Turkish friend from Kadir Has and Dimitris Triantafylou, and very old friend from the first time I stepped my foot in the States, in the United States in 1991, in the summer of 1991. He was there at Fletcher before me, and we became friends. So this has been like a 26-year-old friendship. This is the second time we are meeting in Thessaloniki with this program, and I hope there will be more, because I truly believe, like and everybody else here, that we have a lot of bridges to build, especially among the youth, and we shouldn't let the ball drop on that front. Now, Greek-Turkish relations in the context of NATO. Let me say a few things introductory. The two countries, as you know, became members in 1952. This was the first NATO enlargement. A few more followed. They became, the two of them together as a pair, members of NATO in 1952, as a result basically of the Cold War. After all, 5 years earlier, in 1947, the Truman Doctrine, one of the opening acts of the Cold War, was proclaimed by President Truman with the two countries in mind during the Greek Civil War and Stalin's pressure on Turkey. They both became part of the Marshall Plan aid program, and they were not founding members in 1949, but they did become in 1952 at the time of Greek-Turkish friendship. It was the year when, for the last time until Erdogan recently, a Turkish president visited Greece, Celal Bayar, and the Greek head of state, then King Paul, visited Ankara. There hasn't been a state visit since, until recently, a few days ago. Now, the relationship that started in very friendly terms in 1952 went into a problem. The trick about entering, of course, just to be precise on the historic side, something we often forget, of course, had to do with Korea. NATO, as we know it, is a creation of the Korean War, and Turkey's membership, especially, was because of Turkey's participation in the Korean War. In a way, it washed away the non-participation of Turkey during the Second World War, which is, according to my opinion, the founding war of United Europe. It was the civil war out of which, like the civil war in the States, created the United States, created the unification of the United States of America. The Second World War was a similar event for Europe, of which Turkey, unlike what happened in the First World War, was not part. But thanks to Korea, a few years later, it proved itself as a Western ally, a credible Western ally, and it was invited to be part. However, in very short period of time, the relationship between the two countries, because of Cyprus, went into big trouble. On April 1st, 1955, the armed struggle of EOKA started in Cyprus, and a few months later we had the horrible pogrom against the Greek minority in Istanbul, and the relationship went into decline and had been in trouble ever since, with occasional moments of coming close to full-fledged war. Now, as international relations expert, we wonder what was it that kept the two countries from turning the Cold War into a hot war. And in theory, there have been a lot of suggestions. One credible such suggestion is what we call the hegemonic stability theory, the fact that United States, as a big hegemon, was policing and managing the relationship through NATO. But thanks to NATO membership, peace between the two was preserved, because it would be unthinkable for two NATO allies. It would be a gift sent from God for Soviet Union to see them fight against each other, and America did everything it could, and it did actually, through intervening to keep the tensions from escalating, with the possible exception of 1974, when the then President Nixon was very busy in the shredding machine, destroying all the evidence and papers, shredding day and night. They were jammed. They got
I
jammed.
don't see such a machine here in Navarino.
We are for transparency.
Yeah.
We have nothing to hide. So in the summer of 1974, so America did play, and NATO did play that role, which the Greek left, the Greek neutrality friendly, because in Greece you cannot be, because of geostrategy, pro-Soviet. Just like in the old days you could not be pro-German. Greece is a maritime nation, very much dependent on the power that controls the Mediterranean. It used to be Britain, it has been United States since 1947. So the only way to be anti-Western is to be neutral. That was the King Constantine during the First World War, and that was the Greek left after 1949, neutral. To be neutral. So, as hard as it is for them to admit, for the Greek left, that NATO was beneficial, precisely because many Greeks believe that NATO took the side of Turkey. The truth of the matter is that from a scientific IR point of view speaking, NATO membership did play a big role in keeping the tensions under control within the Cold War context, and it should be acknowledged as such. Now, from 1974 onwards, Greece has tried to move NATO from a collective defense to a collective security organization as much, especially after 1989, when NATO started looking for a new role, since the big old foe disappeared, the Soviet menace. It hasn't been always very successful, but in a way, NATO indirectly was a collective security mechanism as well from the start. After all, it was a coalition, or it proclaimed to be, and it did proclaim so, especially after the Cold War, a coalition of democracies. And being a coalition of democracies, and knowing again from IR theory, democracies don't fight each other, it preserves peace among its members. And here we come to trouble now with Turkey and Turkish democracy from a theoretical always point of view, because Turkey has a unique characteristic in world history. It has the longest transition to democracy, and a transition that never ends and never gets completed, I'm afraid. It started in 1946. The Greek transition of democracy lasted for a few months, basically, in the summer and fall of 1974, just to give you an example. The Spanish transition may be a few years until the first free election in 1979. In Turkey, the transition started in 1946, or if you want, the more competitive elections of 1950, and the landslide victory of the Democratic Party at the time, and it continues to this day. It has gone forward, backwards, coups, restorations, etc., and at the present time, to be sincere, it seems to be sliding backwards, especially after the failed coup of July 2016 and the countermeasures of the Erdogan government that is soon turning into a regime. This is troublesome for the relationship, and it's troublesome for for Turkey's membership into NATO, because democracies don't fight each other. Autocracies, one might claim, don't fight each other that much, but regimes in transition, in theory again, this is what the theory tells us, are the most unstable, and they are most aggressive, externally aggressive. We see this very vividly, of course, in the case of Putin's Russia. The end of Russia's democratization and the installation of a Putin's regime there has something to do with Russia's recent aggressive behavior, first in Georgia in 2008 and more recently in Ukraine in 2014. And there is a question if this can happen with Turkey as well, and this peculiarity of the never-ending transition, a democracy that is never completed. And I've been trying to find another example since 1950, and I haven't. I don't know if my Turkish friends have to say something on this. As a result, we have two peculiar developments, interesting developments. The first is that Greece has become much more pro-NATO, in a way, even if the politicians don't admit it. The fact of the matter that we have a government of the radical left and the anti-Western right, because there is an anti-Western right in Greece, that...
but it likes the dollar also.
So, and the ruble. They don't discriminate, whoever pays. Yes, we have videos dating. So, the fact of the matter that you have such a government in Greece and you have an excellent relationship, according to the US ambassador in Athens, with the United States and in NATO, shows that the relationship is not the preserve of the mainstream parties or of the conservative center-right party, but it has grown to become much more popular. And this is natural, because NATO has proved in the last 10 years at least 2-3 times its value to Greek foreign policy. One in 2008 with a veto on Skopje, on the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Greece would not have blocked had it not been a member, and we wouldn't have the recent pledges on the part of Skopje for a solution had the pressure not been there. The other example is the refugee crisis management, where NATO has deployed for the first time along a NATO border, an inter-NATO border between two NATO members in the Aegean, Greece and Turkey, a fleet to patrol the refugee and migratory flows. And after all, the Greeks, as crazy as they might seem, occasionally they're not stupid. They look at Ireland today. Ireland is not a member, but how does Ireland is connected? Well, the humiliation that Ireland is inflicting on the former imperial power, Britain, which ruled Ireland for centuries, by the mere fact that Ireland is a member of EU, and the UK is not and is ready not to. And the fact that Ireland of 4 million people is imposing its will on London. I mean, look at the historical reversal on the Brexit negotiations on the border with Northern Ireland, shows the value of being part of a multilateral organization and the loss if you decide to leave it. And I think all this filters very well in Greece for all the irrationalities of Greek politics that occasionally burst out. The second element in the relationship has to do with the fact that since 1999, especially as a result of Helsinki, the Greek-Turkish relations has acquired a new depth. It's no longer a high politics only, security-focused relationship mitigated through NATO, but we have an explosion in economic trade relations that we have to acknowledge. In the good old days, all books on Greek-Turkish relations started and ended with Cyprus, maybe territorial waters, the continental, blah, 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 the same old stuff. These days you cannot have a complete book without a big chapter that is getting bigger every year on the political economy of the relationship. And I always point that out to my ultra-realist colleagues at Pantheon, who tend to focus solely on the old politics, the high politics. So Turkey for Greece is the number one destination for exports, or number two. Of course, we are a much smaller economy, we have become much smaller over the last 10 years. But still, you are the number one or number two, depending. Some years it's Germany, some years it's Turkey, our biggest export market. 1 million Turkish tourists coming, many of them here in Thessaloniki, most of them in the northern of Greece. There is an understanding in the Greek business community that Turkey is the biggest. Istanbul alone is a market bigger than the rest of the Balkans put together. The 20 million consumers of Istanbul have a GDP of close to $500 billion, which is more than Bulgaria, Romania, ex-Yugoslavia, Albania put together. And Istanbul is, of course, closer to Thessaloniki than Athens is in kilometers. And even in time now, the road is very good. And unless you get very delayed in the border, you can get to Istanbul very easily. So there are all these new trends, and of course, Greeks moving to Istanbul, Turks buying houses in Greece, now that we have become so cheap. Greeks learning Turkish, etc., etc. So although the high politics and the problems of the high politics have not been resolved, and Helsinki has lost most of its momentum. It seems to me like a Catholic marriage where the couple doesn't speak to each other, but divorce is not an option. Nobody proclaims separation. Both Turkey and Europe have decided to pretend that there is an ongoing negotiation that will go on forever and ever, I suppose. But the truth of the matter, Catholic or not Catholic the marriage, is that the momentum has been lost. Nevertheless, there is a good legacy left from Helsinki. And the fact of the matter is that during the last 17 years, since 2000, 2002, when Erdogan came to power, there has been no crisis between Greece and Turkey. No matter what the Greek media say, for their own populist, ethno-nationalist purposes, and they do say, I mean, from time to time they go into hysteria and you think that war is imminent. The fact of the matter is that the relationship has grown, deepened. Incidents have been avoided. Turkey has avoided exploiting its superiority and the increased power gap between the two. But there is a concern, a very big concern, and I guess this is the big elephant that we cannot avoid talking. Where is Turkey heading? And for us Greeks, who are the neighbors, and especially for us Greeks who believe in Greek-Turkish friendship, and has devoted all our lives, professional lives at least, even some parts of our personal lives, in Greek-Turkish friendship. It is very worrisome, the recent developments on the state of Turkish democracy, state of Turkish relationship with the West, state of EU-Turkish negotiations, and so on and so forth. So there are challenges to be addressed in many fronts, I would say out loud, because I'm Greek and I speak in Greece in front of many good Turks, that Turkey has justifications in the matter of visa, free travel, in the matter of the refugee country. Erdogan is right to point to the hypocrisy of most Europeans when Turkey has received almost 3 million Syrians and other refugees, and Europe cannot receive 1 million without making a huge fuss and go vote for Le Pen and who other crazy, I don't know. And now in Italy, because we have this next big testing ground, the Italian elections on March 4th, and Beppe Grillo, and we'll see what happens. So there are points to be made in favor of Turkey, and I assure you that's also a legacy of Helsinki, that there is a new constituency of Greek analysts, Greek scholars, Greek journalists fewer, who make these points publicly on Greek television, that Turkey is right about visa free, that Turkey is not the Satan and the devil to be blamed for everything, etc. And I think this is also an achievement of Helsinki that broke that old stereotypical kind of points of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Anyway, I think that the exchanges have been multiplied.
Exactly.
I mean, we are approaching now 2 years. If we consider that 99 was the breakthrough of the rapprochement, I think in these 20 years, many good things happened. As you said, and I also mentioned that during the crisis, Turkey refrained from putting extra burden to this.
Exactly.
We have to recognize this. I mean, it was a relation of normalcy, I would say, normalization. And we can only hope that normalization will further deepen. I mean, because we have to look at the strategic picture. Turkey is challenged east. I mean, there are big, very serious challenges east, and it's only with our mutual interest to have Turkey well, anxious, in the institutional framework of a rules-based system. This, I think, is our common perception here, the founding. And on this note, I turn to my other good old friend, Zahab, for his remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Chairwoman.
Chairwoman.
Madam
Chair. Sorry, Madam Chair. Sorry, Madam Chair.
I'm not a fanatic, you know.
No, you're right. You made a good point. Well, it's a pleasure to sit around this table and to be able to present my views to this interesting group of young people, some of them students, scholars, and civil society members of civil society. For me, as a Turk, I mean, half of my ancestors were originally from this part of the world. Therefore, you know, I always treasure the experience of coming back to Thessaloniki. And God knows how many times I've been to this city for various purposes. And I know I'm among friends. When I met Dimitri and Mustafa Hoca, it was 2 weeks before this globally traumatic event, 9/11, at Halki. You know, we met at Halki in 2001, 2 weeks before 9/11. And I met, visit to NATO in 2000. So, and Dimitri, you know, we joined Kadir Has University on the same day, 2010. Each of us can be staunch defenders of our own country's national interests, but on the other hand, we have grown to recognize the benefits of working together, cooperation, etc. So we have come a long way in understanding each other's sensitivities and taking advantage of multilateral institutions or structures in promoting our national interests while not causing damage to the relationship. And that's what institutions are about. You know, back to basics, Introduction to International Relations or International Relations 101. What good are institutions? You know, what good? Well, they increase sense of security, or they offer ways out of security dilemma or prisoner's dilemma, right? You are less concerned with relative gains when you're part of a multilateral institution. There is stability of expectations, you know. The other side may gain a little more this time, but you know that because of the predictability, you will be playing the same game time and again, and next time you will gain more. Therefore, in the long run, as long as the game is on, you know, the benefits will balance each other out. So this is how the institutions are supposed to function. And in the case of Turkey and Greece, ideally, if the two countries were members of the European Union, you know, life would be a lot easier for us. But NATO is the only game in town for the time being. We will be discussing, or I'll be discussing, the future of Turkish-Greek relations in the NATO context. So we have to, I guess, discuss the future of Turkish-Greek relations and the future of NATO, and try to combine, you know, the degree, the extent to which their futures will overlap. As it has been mentioned here on this panel several times, Turkey and Greece are first-generation NATO members. Let's, you know, set the record straight. We're talking about 65 years of membership in NATO. You know, they've been members of NATO longer than Germany. So we have to grant that. And what was the original purpose of NATO? To put it simply, Lord Ismay defined it as keeping Russians out, Americans in, and Germans down, right? So where do we stand today? I mean, is NATO supposed to function that way? In other words, keep the Russians out, Americans in, and the Germans down. I'll come back to this later. Well, until and unless Turkey and Greece, you know, made sense in the context of these objectives, they were not admitted to NATO. And their membership made sense when Cold War went global after the Korean War. We Turks tend to believe that Turkish participation or committing a full-fledged brigade to the war in Korea, you know, kind of unlocked the door of NATO membership to NATO. There is a certain degree of, there is a kernel of truth in that, but the story was totally different. It was related to Korea, but Turkish membership, along with Greek membership, made sense in the context of a change in American strategy. You know, after the adoption of NSC 68. So it was a part of the global US strategy to contain the Soviets globally. Well, as soon as they were members, they were presented with the challenge of promoting their national interest in a multilateral institution, a military alliance to be precise. It was a challenge for both Greece and Turkey, plus other members of NATO. Because as Dimitri already covered it, you know, as soon as they were members, they were at loggerheads over the future of Cyprus. And with the exception of the first couple of years of membership, after 1954-55, their NATO memberships were kind of compromised by their dispute in and over Cyprus. But that was a manageable dispute, relatively speaking. I mean, they could manage their differences within NATO because the Soviet threat was overwhelming, and you know they had little resources to spare for their national bones of contention, I would say. So Soviet Union remained the principal focus in their threat perceptions. But that changed in 1974. In 1974, it became a different story. Then both tried to use NATO to promote their national interests at the expense of the other side. The result was a total deadlock in NATO. You know, both sides blocked NATO's annual force generation plans, exercises, this and that. The southern flank of NATO was paralyzed for some time. So their membership in a multilateral setting did not work in containing, in limiting the conflict potential. Nevertheless, they never fought. They never fought. You know, they came close to the brink of war a couple of times, but thankfully, they never fought. After 1947, indeed, the presence of NATO, especially in their vicinity or in the Mediterranean, in a way helped them, spare their resources, military and naval assets, to organize against each other. So NATO membership, in a way, gave them the opportunity, the sufficient margins to organize their military forces to be used against each other in the last decade of the Cold War. Well, I mean, I love John Lennon, especially one of the lyrics from one of his poems or songs. Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. Cold War ended abruptly and unexpectedly in 1989. That was a whole new situation for us. And the following decade was horrible as far as Turkish-Greek relations were concerned. We had a series of crises. Some of them induced, some of them inadvertent, like in the case of India Kardak crisis. But the first decade after the end of the Cold War was marked by intense hostility, conflict potential, and lack of cooperation. And partly the denial of EU candidacy to Turkey was responsible for that. Towards the end of the decade, indeed, when Turkey's EU candidacy became a possibility, both sides, the two sides, found very creative, innovative ways of using NATO to introduce confidence-building measures in the Aegean. One example. The main problem in the Aegean for military flights was Athens' insistence that Turkey should submit flight plans of all aircraft, military aircraft, whereas Turkey refuses this request on the grounds that FIR responsibility has nothing to do with the flight of state or government aircraft. The midway solution was that each year, I think it was in 1999, Papandreou, the son, Yorgo Papandreou, or the young Yorgo Papandreou, and Ismail Cenk,
The grandson.
grandson, the youngest Papandreou, Eldest, elder, and the youngest. Anyway, Yorga Papandreou and Ismail Cem came up with a formula. Maybe it was Ismail Cem's idea. Turkey began to submit its military flight plans to Brussels, the NATO headquarters in Brussels, every day. And those plans were distributed to all members, including Greece. So this was a way of resolving the conflict with the help of NATO. So it proved, NATO membership proved useful. Moreover, both were represented in NATO, both were long-time members of NATO. Therefore, compared to EU, where in terms of representation there was a marked asymmetry, NATO helped fill that vacuum in the representation gap. Meanwhile, the two countries' NATO allies also learned to deal with the two countries, two troublemaking alliance members. They developed measures to address their sensitivities. Whenever NATO conducts an exercise in the Aegean, they always keep an eye on Turkish and Greek sensitivities so that they are not seen as part of or taking sides in one or the other dispute with Greece or Turkey. One practical problem which poisoned Turkish-Greek relations in the aftermath of the Cold War was the NATO command and control arrangements. It had always been a problematic issue, but once the Cold War ended, the alliance embarked on a process of transformation, and there was this huge, ambitious attempt to reorganize NATO military structure in particular, and this had the potential to deteriorate the relationship, but at the end of the day, NATO came up with a very streamlined, very, how should I put it? It slimmed down its organizational structure, and therefore this reorganization of NATO rendered previous disputes untenable and irrelevant. Therefore, Turkey and Greece no longer fight over command and control responsibilities in and over the Aegean. But this doesn't, of course, deter them from making statements to assert their established positions in the Aegean. In the process, they both developed means and instruments to remain relevant to NATO militarily. Turkey was, I think, between the two, Turkey was the first to develop, raise, and commit a core headquarters, which is called NATO Rapid Deployment Corps, which is in Istanbul, and followed by Greek Rapid Deployment Corps, which is in Larissa. So they kept an eye on each other, but on the other hand, they cooperated because both became members of a new club, an upper chamber in NATO, as providers of rapid reaction forces in case of need. And this also helped them to intensify and improve their cooperation at the technical and functional level. Now, for about 2 years, NATO has operating in the disputed waters of the Aegean. This was first, and this was unprecedented. To tackle with the refugee crisis, in a way, NATO was introduced to NATO. To the surprise of many, including myself. I could not believe when I heard that NATO was going to operate in the disputed waters of the Aegean to help curb the refugee flow from Turkey to Greece and hence and thence to the other parts of Europe. But that's also a sign, that in such critical issues like controlling refugee flow or immigration flow, although normally it was a job that should have been performed by the EU, Frontex, but for Turkey, having EU flagged vessels patrolling the waters of the Aegean would be totally unacceptable. Therefore, NATO offered an acceptable alternative in that regard, and despite Turkey's objections, the mission is still going on, and I think Germans provide the flagship, So the mission, and now Dutch, and the Dutch. So it helped curb the refugee flow.
Albania participates.
Yeah, but the problem is, the state of affairs is in NATO is not that promising. They have problems with fourth generation. So they literally need any and every naval vessel to help curb the refugee flow in the Aegean. So Albania's small patrol vessel is considered even a big contribution to the mission. Understandably, of course, this mission operates as part of NATO's bigger mission, the Operation Sea Guard, which is fulfilled by standing NATO Maritime Group 2. Turkey and Greece are top contributors to that group.
And
Greece will...
European Union.
And they support, well, the bulk of the force supports the EU mission in the central Mediterranean, and Turkey and Greece each provide one ship, a major surface unit to that mission. But in the Aegean, for the Aegean mission, I think Greece maintains a two-ship contribution, whereas Turkey too. So, although that we have unresolved disputes in the Aegean, it seems that on a practical issue, on a non-traditional threat, NATO offered them an instrument to resolve that without prejudice to their claims, contending claims in the Aegean. Future of NATO and future of Turkish-Greek relations. Well, the problem is, have kept referring to rapprochement. Rapprochement was good initially because it was the beginning, opening stage. But we are stuck at the rapprochement stage. Rapprochement has not... Always. No, rapprochement has failed to transform into a more sustainable, detente-like, state of affairs. Sustainable. Okay? So we have this problem of sustainability.
Substantial.
Don't use S word.
Oh my God, I was going to say solid. No, not solid. Okay, but well, we have to move beyond rapprochement. Let me put it this way. And we're still stuck at the stage of rapprochement. And the EU anchor, we thought, would help us, to turn this rapprochement into something durable. Not as good. Durable, but we can no longer rely on EU anchor. So what we are left with is NATO. We have NATO only.
And Donald Trump.
And Donald Trump. Well, now the challenges. There are a multitude of challenges. Donald Trump, he's the greatest threat to the global security. Leaving him aside, of course. Yeah, I would really say that. Okay, what he did, last night. Just to win the anyway, I'll finish with that. As Professor Aydin described Russia, as the elephant in the room. Russia, Turkish-Russian relations, and the future of Turkey as a NATO member. There is a heated debate going on in Turkey whether Turkey should stay in NATO or not, or should seek a better future by continuing to cooperate with Iran and Russia, and even with China. So this has been debated seriously. But there is very little focus on the costs of leaving NATO at this point, and what kind of impact it may have on Turkish-Greek relations, particularly in the absence of the EU anchor for Turkey. Therefore, the future, NATO's future is questionable. Turkey's NATO membership, Turkey's future as a NATO member is being disputed, increasingly disputed, and the kind of ramifications, NATO's transformation and Turkish changing heart and mind about NATO on Turkish relations remain to be seen. But we are at a crossroads yet again, in many respects, and if NATO ceases to be the only multilateral framework where Turkey and Greece confidently promote or seek to promote their interests, then we might see not only a backslide to authoritarianism in Turkey or moving away from democracy, but a return of conflictual trends in Turkish-Greek relations. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much. You have to go. Okay. Okay, then we have to thank you
No
for your
discussion.
contribution. Okay, all right. Immediately send an SMS. Okay, so you have to leave immediately.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Ella, say, quickly.
Quickly.
This is professor. First of all, I would like to say that I like to be a little bit provocative, so don't get me wrong.
You agree?
Yeah, so I will play the role of the fire starter. I would like to question the point of Mr. Keridis and of Mr. Aydin about the impartiality of NATO, and by extension, the USA. NATO and Henry Kissinger, by extension, did nothing.
There is no extension between NATO and Kissinger.
Okay.
So you are wrong from the start. I'm
Up to the point because Dimitri has to...
Yeah. Did nothing to prevent the Attila II from happening. And at the same time, did everything it could to stop Greece to react.
That's the question.
Yeah.
May I answer?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you're going to lump together questions from the floor.
Is there any other
Yeah, but
question for me?
For Dimitri, sir.
Before I go?
We can...
Okay, quickly.
Just a clarification question. You said Turkey didn't impose any more hardship to Greece during the crisis. Sorry if I missed, but what was it imposing before and didn't do during the crisis, and why was it?
Could have been, but...
There was a lot, okay, I'll start with the latter and then very quickly. There was a lot of concern in Greece when the crisis erupted in 2009-2010 that Turkey might take advantage of Greece's weakening position. And to take advantage of Greece's weakening position is, I can come up with several scenarios of how this can happen by sending an exploration-based vessel on Greek continental, on the disputed continental shelf.
Disputed quote to quote,
Yes,
because
yes,
they are not disputed according to the Greek.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, for
rescuing.
So on the Aegean continental shelf, and then putting the Greek leadership under pressure to react somehow and provoke an incident, etc., etc. This did not happen. We have not seen increased activity on the part of Turkey over the Aegean. I mean, we have violations of Greek airspace, of territorial waters, etc., etc., but nothing of the extraordinary, neither in quality nor in quantity, I would claim, although Greek media tend to have a very short memory and report on the recent without providing the overall picture that is not as negative. And on the other hand, Turkey has supported Greek recovery by its market muscle, by sending tourists, etc., etc. So one can say that the realists proved wrong. I mean, if you want to be theoretically conscious, when someone gets weak, the stronger gets the upper hand, and nature hates vacuums. We have not seen that happening overall in the Aegean, without that meaning that the situation is perfect, far from it. Now, this is a long debate. To cut a long story short, obviously Cyprus was not a member of NATO at the time and not today.
But it was an issue of the bilateral relationship.
Yeah. But Cyprus, the independent state of Cyprus, was not a member of NATO thanks to the efforts of the Cypriot and the Greek left, basically. And when the Attila II invasion happened, neither the Third World, the non-aligned movement, of which Makarios had invested so much, move a single finger. Nor the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc did anything. The only country that imposed an embargo on Turkey's armament was America.
The Congress.
Yes, America. Congress is America.
Okay, yeah,
Why don't we talk about?
Eh?
Why don't we talk about 64 and 67?
Yes, exactly.
The United States stands against Turkey.
Yes,
Please.
yes.
Good historian.
So there was the US embargo against Turkey, the only embargo of which both the European and the Soviets tried to take advantage of. Of course, the embargo didn't last long, we know that. We should not try to find scapegoats for our own mistakes in Cyprus that summer. I wouldn't go as far as say that thanks to the Turkish invasion, Greek democracy was restored, as many Turks would likely point out.
Not only in Greece, but in Cyprus as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
See you later. Let's. How many?
But there is one point I want to make for that, and that moves to. There is a connection between questioning NATO membership and democratization. The two are connected. As long as Greek democracy was under consolidation, with the rise of the populist left during the 80s, Father Papandreou, etc., it was contested. The US military bases, NATO membership, etc. The moment that this has been completed, and the democracy is fully consolidated, and Greek politics in that sense has been normalized. Membership is no longer part of the Greek debate. And I think this is connected with Turkey, what is happening today, where the membership is contested for domestic reasons, not for Turkey's strategic national interest or of any kind, but for domestic reasons. Of course, always there is a leftist in the room to bring back the past, which I thought we had left behind. But it's interesting that we have left that past behind, and now you have embraced that past with zeal and force, and I wish you good luck.
And you're living with that.
So, Dimitri Triandafilou.
We have to cut it short, and we are running really over.
All right.
The coffee is waiting.
So,
We can also do a coffee break.
We have two, three questions maybe, or one to each.
Unprovocative, huh?
Whatever you wish. Yes, please, because you didn't ask. Please stand up.
Anyway, my name is Alexander, to thank the organizer of this meeting. I came from the business world, not the academia, fortunately, and I'm participating in a joint venture between Turkish and Greek company construction sector, and as well as a member of the Confederation of Greek Industrialists and Enthusiasts, the Turkish representative, we try to promote the mutual understanding between the two countries. My question is $1 million actually dollar question, which is Dimitri saying about where is heading Turkey in terms of the NATO role, and actually west or east or west, where is the best? Of course, if we are going to take from our Turkish participants here, the question is going to take the rates a North Korean vote of 99% to be in terms of the West, but unfortunately there is the hidden mass of Anatolia. Turkey become much more conservative, and that which is really struck me, don't forget that 20 days ago was the Papandreou, the head advisor of the Turkish presidency, which is even claimed Mr. Topçu.
I have no idea who he is, but yeah, go ahead. Tell what he
Yeah,
said.
it's Yalcin Sue is
Okay, what he
the
said.
head of.
So the question
The
is about...
question, even 20 days ago, he questioned even the Turkey's NATO participation and was in favor of Turkey's unilateral withdrawal from this collective security mechanism. Do you think that because the check and balance of the Turkish security establishment has diminishing, there is going to be a gradual process from Turkey withdraw from this Western?
Okay.
The answer needs another conference, whole day actually. Look, I mentioned the surveys that I do, but others do, and Serhat will collaborate this. If you ask the Turkish people, and we do, that which country or countries that Turkey should align itself with in international affairs, the overwhelming majority says that go alone. Right? None of the countries, they don't prefer to be. The Turkish public, I think about 67% or something, regularly always say that Turkey should stand alone in world politics. So this is something ingrained into the Turkish psyche. Any kind of an alignment with any kind of a country, not be it a NATO country, NATO or Europe or Russia, China, Muslim countries, Turkic countries, because I asked them all of them. They are not favored by Turkish people. And we have a saying in Turkey, the only friend for the Turks are the Kurds. You know, all this. So there is this kind of a framework. Having said that, the rationality of most of Turkish population is quite well known. I mean, you know, despite the ups and downs and going sideways and etc., the rationality is always there. The support for NATO membership, despite all the discussions, Serhat already mentioned, there are this discussion on the elite level mainly. And usually, I think I agree with Dimitris on that, that this is for the consumption of domestic politics. Because when you ask the population whether they still support Turkish membership in NATO, the support is always more than 60%, like 70%. So there is not much in the mass, you mentioned, identity about doubt about this. And the question, what is Turkey, is a perennial question. It's not only in Turkey, but in Europe and in the West. I've done my PhD like more than 20 years ago, looking for the papers written on Turkey. You come across every 5 to 7 years, a number of papers are written about where Turkey is headed from the Western. When you look at all the Western newspapers, which I did quite many of them, you always have this every 5 to 7 years, similar question. But you know, here we are after all these years.
Yeah, well.
And the response, I mean, you know, it's very difficult question to, I myself personally, when I look at Turkey today, my convictions are aside, I have a trouble answering where Turkey is going. It's very difficult to predict and to see within inside, because there are so many things are changing at the moment. I'm not running away the question, but it's very difficult really to predict. And maybe this is, for the first time in the last 50 years, the question where Turkey is heading is really a valuable question and right to answer, but it's more than $1 million question. So.
Okay.
All right.
Is there any other imminent question that has to be asked?
And a few things.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
What we call Attila II and what we call peace operation phase 2. Okay? Ankara did not seek the approval of the United States before it launched it. It sought the acquiescence of Moscow through a KGB operator of Azeri descent who was based in Ankara. So for them, Moscow's reaction was more important than Washington's reaction in that case. And at the time, you know, the foreign policy staff clustered around Bülent Ecevit had a third world mind, you know, non-alignment mind. So for them, you know, U.S. was presented with a choice, with two choices. lose Turkey or lose Greece. And they obviously picked Turkey. They could not afford to lose Turkey. Therefore, they made the choice. But Ankara was ready to, head away from the West and to join the non-alignment ranks. And I think Kissinger, I don't want to give him credit for anything, but Kissinger saw it.
He realized.
He realized that, and he was a realist. So for him, he probably weighed, relative costs and benefits of stopping Turks, which the Americans had done a decade ago. So he didn't want to repeat that. So he knew what the consequences would be.
Thank you very much.